What is happening, guys? So last night, I had a big hit in DraftKings NBA DFS. I won $20,000. And what I want to do here is not just review the lineup or anything like that, but I want to talk about the actual strategy that I used and how I used the tools at stochastic.com to help me win the money that I did last night. And I'll throw the lineup up on screen here just to make a general point about some of the players that were in the lineup, because late swap is really important to this lineup. And if you guys are familiar with NBA DFS, I'm not giving any new information. You guys know that late swap is important, but for this lineup in particular, it was massive. When I had a guy like Blake Wesley in the lineup, who is only at 11% ownership for the slate and was one of the best overall points per dollar plays of the night, but we didn't end up finding that out until after lock because Trey Jones was ruled out post-lock. Wesley was ruled the starting point guard. And then we had other players in the lineup as well that were benefiting from injury scenarios that happened post-lock. Both Şengün and Jalen Green benefited from Jabari Smith Jr. getting ruled out after lock. And then also we have players from the Memphis Grizzlies in this lineup. That was a lineup that also didn't come out until post-lock. Luke Kennard was ruled out shortly before lock, but the actual official starting lineup for the Grizzlies, we didn't know it until after the slate had started. So one thing that is very important to me using our sims is not just running optimal lineups, but also trying to apply some strategy to it and making sure that my lineups are as flexible as possible to allow me to get to some of these late swap scenarios. So one thing I want to show here on screen, and I will take myself off screen right now because what do you need to look at me for? Is the post-contest simulator, which I also recommend you guys look at. So it's not enough to just build your lineups and check the results. You should also be looking back at the slate and figure out, all right, where did you go right? Where did you go wrong? And that's going to improve your process overall as a DFS player. So if you were building lineups right before lock, one of the best overall points per dollar plays on the slate and somebody you'd be getting a lot of exposure to in the Sims was Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And the field was getting to him a whole bunch. He's projected, or he ended up being, don't have to talk about projected ownership. The slate's already happened. We know what the guy's ownerships were. Nickeil Alexander-Walker ended up being 32.1% owned. And like I said, going into lock, he was one of the best points per dollar plays on the slate. Despite that, I only have him in 12% of my lineups. So why? Well, here's why. Because there were so many players questionable on the injury report and so much unknown scenarios that I just walked through my winning lineup. We had Trey Jones was questionable at lock. I knew if he was ruled out, it was going to open up value. Didn't end up impacting this particular lineup, but Kyrie Irving was questionable heading into lock. We didn't know the Memphis Grizzlies starting lineup. We didn't know if Jabari Smith Jr. was going to be announced. So there's a lot that could change that could potentially open up a lot of value, and not just value, but value that was going to be lower owned than the chalk we had going into the slate. Like Blake Wesley, for instance, is somebody who had a similar projection to Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but was cheaper and only ended up having a third of the ownership because so many people already had spots in their lineups taken up by the first couple games on the slate. They didn't have the flexibility to be able to alter their lineups. So even though Nickeil Alexander-Walker was one of the best points per dollar plays at the time that the slate started, by the time it was over, if we look at our post-contest sims, everybody who played him in lineups on the whole had a negative 51.4% ROI in their lineups. So lineups with Nickeil Alexander-Walker in general ended up losing last night. And even in our sims, he had a negative 27.3% simulated player ROI, even though, like I said, he looked good going into the slate, because as all these other players get ruled out, they ended up being much better options. So what I do when I'm building my lineups is I'm trying to take that into account, especially when there are a lot of players that are questionable on the injury report. So I've already got a set of lineups that are built out for this slate, and we don't have to worry too much about the individual player exposures or anything like that. What I want to do is show you guys how I approach slates where a bunch of players are listed as questionable. And if I'm getting exposure to the first game on the slate really heavily, how I'm going to modify my lineups in the Sims, with the goal being of creating as much flexibility in my lineups that when the news breaks later on the night, I have the ability to make swaps to my lineups using the late swap tool that other people in the field are not going to be getting to, like a Blake Wesley, who is massive for me hitting the lineup that I did last night. So what I do is, for this slate, the Utah Jazz, for instance, are a team that locks at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So one of the first game, or the first game on the slate. If this was a slate that had a bunch of players questionable in the later stages of the game, in the later stages of the slate, I mean to say, I don't want a lot of my lineup spots being taken up by players from the Utah Jazz. So what I would do is I would look at somebody like Kelly Olynyk here, and I would do a negative ROI boost to him. So while right now he's in 70% of my lineups, I might go in here and I'll say, all right, I'm going to do a negative 50% boost to Kelly Olynyk, which is exactly what I did with Nickeil Alexander-Walker last night, so that it would pull him out of lineups. And then after doing that, I go to my favorite lineups. I unfavorite them, refavorite my top 150 lineups. And now Kelly Olynyk is no longer one of my most rostered players. Now Kelly Olynyk is in, let's see. So Kelly Olynyk is now in 23% of my lineup. So much more modest rate than the 70% I had before. And what I would do is I would go through all of the players that I'm getting a bunch of exposure to from the first game on the slate, and I would do a negative ROI downgrade to all these guys. So Colin Sexton, Walker Kessler. And the goal being is not to totally take these players out of my player pool, because keep in mind, if you look at the post-contest sim, I still had some exposure to Nickeil Alexander-Walker. It wasn't much. It wasn't as much as the field had. Field had 32% and I had 12%. But I want to make sure that the only lineups that I'm getting these players to are my absolute top projected lineups, because I'm operating under the assumption that in a lot of these scenarios, there's going to be better value that opens up later on the slate. So this isn't a strategy to implement on 100% of NBA DFS slates, but it is one to implement on a lot of slates. So if you're going into lock and there are a bunch of unknown situations, players who are listed as questionable, go into the Sims tool after you've built your lineups and simulated them and do an ROI downgrade boost to players who are in that first game on the slate. That is going to make it so your lineups have a little bit more flexibility, not quite as many players that are locked in the first part of the game. And that's going to enable you to be able to swap onto players who are lower owned value options in later stages of the slate, who are going to be under owned and are going to be some of the top plays of the night. So I hope that helps you guys use our Sims tools, and maybe also makes you rethink some of your strategies as you approach NBA DFS. If you like the video, then like it and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want to sign up for the Sims tools that we have at Stokastic.com, there are links for those below. Good luck. And you guys could always hit me up if you ever have any kind of questions. Our Discord channel, it's full of our data scientists as well as analysts. We could always help you with any questions you have about our Sims tool. So check that out as well if you guys are a Stokastic member. Stop guessing, start winning, and join Stokastic today.